I mean, today's theme is about the power of conversation around mental health. And I think I would say that, having worked in the Muslim community for the past 7 years or so, within mental health, it's a conversation that comes up quite a lot. In that, I think people do struggle to talk about mental health and well-being. Sometimes because of their situations and circumstances, sometimes because of upbringing. There are different barriers that people face in terms of, why it's difficult to talk about mental health. But I think ultimately, from where we're sitting now, it feels as if things are changing. I think there's definitely, a change in the air, you could call it, in that people are becoming a bit more comfortable talking about these topics. And I think that one thing I've definitely noticed over the past few years is that there's this rise in linking mental health in with faith, with Islam. And I think that really gives rise to people becoming more comfortable about talking about their emotions from within a faith perspective.
Yeah.
And acknowledging what Islam says about emotions, Islam says about mental health, and why it's important for us to acknowledge and talk about mental health. So I think that's what I've noticed over the past few years. I don't know, Manaal, what you've noticed in your work recently.
Yeah. First of all, I absolutely agree with what you were saying, that there is that, I think that faith lens that's now been added to the discussion, which, when you think about it, especially as a professional, that I guess should have always been there, but it's nice to see that addition is there. I think for me, when I really reflect on that question about, conversation around mental health, for me, I'm thinking, especially in the community that I come from, that there is so much conversation about, well, just health in general, but it's very much geared towards physical health. And this is not me saying that we have two types of health, physical health and mental health. It is all one health. But, you will often hear people speak about kind of aches and pains and, kind of needing support from a doctor, a GP. And very rarely are we actually making the link between, that kind of mind-body connection. And I think particularly for me, I've really come to notice that for myself. I even tell my clients, I work as a psychotherapist, and I even tell my clients that whenever I get stressed, I have a headache. That is how that's kind of my body trying to tell me that something's going on, listen to me. So, just thinking of the language that feels accessible to people, I think it very much seems to start with the kind of physical signs, and I really hope that we were able to kind of make that link a bit more and see, right, what's going on for us mentally, that our body's responding that way. But that's really where I'm coming from right now. Yeah.
It's very interesting what you say about language. One thing we've noticed is that when you have events and workshops and things like that where mental health is talked about, when you label things with that mental health title, or when you put depression in or anxiety, and I think it almost scares people away. It's almost like, oh, this is a little bit too uncomfortable for me to talk about, and I can't discuss these topics, or it just feels a little bit heavy, I think, for people. And sometimes that's the sort of feedback that we've had as well from people, in that, maybe the titles need to be gentler. Maybe we need to not call it depression. Maybe we need to call it something else. Maybe we need to say emotions instead of mental health. And I wonder again if that's a cultural sort of or a something relating to upbringing and how things have traditionally been talked about or been discussed in terms of emotions. As you say, often, especially with the old generations, you see that they had no way of communicating when they experienced low mood or depression or anxiety, and often it would manifest as a physical ailment or a headache or a tummy ache or some kind of an illness. you hear about, you probably come across, GPs who talk about BBitis, where, typically Asian women, or South Asian women in particular, would go to the doctors and present with all of these physical ailments that just could not be explained. And it would sometimes, transpire that actually there was something going on with their mental emotional well-being, and it just wasn't picked up on, or they could not identify it, or they couldn't verbalize it in a language that they knew how to communicate in. So I think that thing around labels and language that we use is so important, I think, to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up such an excellent point about language, where when I think of some of the more kind of native languages in the community, are there even words for depression, for anxiety? And when I think of kind of specific languages, I'm thinking even the way that those words, would be interpreted, if it's not exactly depression or exactly anxiety, but it seems very linked to the body inherently, which, I guess tells us a lot that we've, in some ways been attuned to our body, and that maybe we aren't just making that connection yet. But I think gentle language is really interesting, especially when when you think of bringing something like mental health to a group of people that are, just starting to hear about it, or we're just starting to, I guess, address the stigma that seems to come with it. I wonder if gentle language could help us reduce the stigma as well.
Yeah.
Even the title of this this kind of conversation about mental health, is mental health still accessible to people, or as you said, kind of emotional health or well-being? Really, we could go on for hours about this, just language.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, do you think things are shifting compared to, I mean, obviously you've worked for a number of years as well in the field. Do you feel, based on the clients that you come across and the work that you've seen, that things are shifting, that people are becoming more and more comfortable around these topics and these discussions?
I think, yes, for sure, things are shifting. I find it really interesting sometimes because most of my work, I would say, is with more Generation Z, millennials. And sometimes I find that language around mental health has become so common for them that, and my job as a psychotherapist is to really explore what those words mean for them. If they come in with a self-diagnosis as well, again, it's really about validating that for them and seeing what that means for them. But it seems like kind of a stark opposite to the kind of older clients that I see, where sometimes depression, anxiety, whatever that might be, is not necessarily a part of their day-to-day language. But with younger people, it seems like it's so normalized. Say, I'm feeling really anxious today, or the weather's really depressing. And I do wonder, how does that impact how they actually feel? Because obviously language is such a kind of important factor in how we interpret what's actually happening for us.
It's an interesting point you raised about young people, actually, and that ease of conversation around mental health and the language that they're familiar with. I remember having a discussion a while back with some of the colleagues that I work with, and one of the things that came up out of that discussion was that many young people, especially from the Muslim community, feel that when they go to college or university or work, they're very comfortable talking about their emotions, and they're very comfortable talking about mental health in general as a topic. But actually, when these same young people are accessing spaces such as mosques or Islamic centers, or they're at home with their families, that they're having to really think about what they're saying, and they don't feel the same ease. It just doesn't kind of flow as easily the conversation around, I'm really struggling with my emotions today, or I'm finding this really tough, or and it's interesting that even though sometimes there's a generational shift, that
Yeah.
young people often feel that they have to think about the space they're in and how they navigate the various spaces, and how they cater the language they're using, or cater the discussions and the conversations around the people they're with. And it's sad that people should have to do that, but I think it's a reality, right? I don't know if you've come across that as well.
Yeah. Gosh, what you've described, it feels so disheartening that they're able to, kind of bring their authentic self in a way to some spaces, but it's really hard to just bring the part of themselves that's, I guess, just wanting help, wanting to be heard in other spaces. To be honest with you, I haven't come across enough of that in my practice, but what I would say is there's definitely a shift between kind of home life and uni life, or home life and kind of work life. So what they might address with their parents, their extended family, versus what they feel comfortable addressing with their friends. And
Mm,
it's kind of code switching, right? You switch from one environment to another. You might change the way that you speak, you might change the content of what you speak. So from that perspective, I guess it makes sense. But I'm also then thinking, what can we do to make these spaces more, I guess, more accessible when we're thinking of conversations about mental health? Is that, especially in a uni environment, those conversations do tend to become a little bit more accessible because you see it so much. I think
mm.
universities are really big on, speaking about student mental health. So maybe it's about bringing those initiatives to within our communities as well, not just outside of them.
Mm. I wonder if it's also partly a fear and an anxiety of what happens next. So if I was to raise the issue of, let's just say, a young person in my family, if I'd said, I'm feeling depressed right now, what happens next? And where could it lead to? And sometimes I think for many young people, maybe if they've got that perception that my family won't be able to help me if I disclose my issues, or what, I don't know what will happen next. Will my parents get upset? Will they be able to deal with what I've just told them? Or because it's very different in, if they know for sure that if I said outside the house, or at university or at college or at work, that I was depressed, that there may be some form of help there for me, that it may be perceived quite differently, and that it may be that somebody's ready there to support me with what I'm going through. Whereas at home, or whereas within the mosque setting or the Islamic center setting, or wherever they've been, perhaps that same culture around support around mental health isn't there. And I know that's shifting. I know we see that there's some incredible work being done around various mosques and Islamic centers and Islamic organizations as well, but I think there's still a lot more work to be done. And I think definitely more conversations need to happen. I think one thing that really heartens me is that we're seeing more and more Muslim spaces, or Muslim run spaces like mosques, open their doors to mental health professionals, open their doors to just that topic of mental health, and bringing in, especially in relation to Islam. I mean, there's definitely been a growth for the last few years now in an understanding around Islamic psychology, and what our own history is, in that if we're truly going to be holistic, or to take a holistic approach to mental health and well-being, then we've got to embrace the fact that our religion also teaches about these topics. And historically and traditionally, we do have scholars that taught and actually encouraged us to deal with difficult emotions. It's just for some reason it's been lost along the way, and we've got to a stage where perhaps it's that dilution of faith and culture, and different cultures have come together to kind of culminate in this newer culture of discomfort around talking about emotions. Whereas actually, as Muslims, I think well and truly we should be able to talk about these topics just as we do any other health topic. You know, in actual fact, I think when we go right the way back to, you know, the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you know, the lives of the Sahabas, and we do hear about examples of, you know, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself cried, you know, and we know that tears are sacred in Islam. We know that, you know, to show emotion is not weakness within Islam. There is actually a sacredness in tears, and a beauty in being able to show our emotions and express, you know, even when we make dua and we cry, you know, and so, and I wonder whether this is a really beautiful way of perhaps bringing in this topic more within those Muslim run spaces, in that, you know, we need to become more comfortable talking about emotions. You know, why is it that we feel so much discomfort? Where does that come from? Is it intergenerational? Is it cultural? Is it, you know, I don't know where that comes from, but it's good to see things shifting and changing, but I think a lot more still needs to happen.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing those examples. I think it is such a kind of good way to start that conversation within our community. And I think, you know, if I were to reflect on, you know, why, right? Why have we kind of lost that touch? And I think you named it earlier, you know, that dilution of culture and faith, and how we navigate that space, perhaps. You know, especially culturally, I think oftentimes there is so much, I think, shame attached to even struggling with your mental health, without naming it. There's so much suffering in silence that, you know, there's that kind of get on with it attitude without actually acknowledging what you're having to get on with. And obviously it is very, very painful to go through that. But I really like that we're kind of heading in a direction where, you know, we're not just equipping people to have those conversations around mental health within our communities, but we're also normalizing it, and you know, putting in that kind of faith lens, which is, you know, this is human. This is, you know, our faith has shown that for, you know, years before, and it's just about coming back to it. You know, it's coming back to the knowledge that we already have. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Do you think that, you know, hearing young people talk more and more about mental health will affect a change within the older generation as well? Because that's a complaint we hear often, right? In that it's the older generation, you can't talk to them, they won't discuss mental health, you know. So where do you see that shift happening? And do you feel young people have an impact on their parents and you know, their older generations?
it's so interesting you asked that question, because I feel like, I feel like my home in a way is a living example of that. So you know, a few years ago, you know, before I started my my training for psychotherapy, I definitely was struggling with my mental health, and I started to access therapy at one point. And I actually started to bring those conversations to the dinner table. So, you know, every evening we would have dinner together as a family, and I, you know, just started to speak a little bit about how mental health can show up. You know, what does that mean? And since then, I have seen a shift in my family, at least, where, you know, when I see that some of my family members are concerned about someone, they don't just ask about their physical health anymore, but they actually ask them, you know, are you thinking about something? Like, is something on your mind? And, you know, the language is subtle, absolutely, you know, gentle, if we could use that word, but it's there. You know, there is a, it's almost like saying, do you know what? I see that. I see that mental health could be something that's coming up for you. And I think it's certainly had a ripple effect on my extended family, where you know, I've had cousins who've actually gone to a psychiatrist, you know, a more specialist service, to see, you know, I think I'm struggling. You know, it's the first time that they've been able to just openly say that. And I think there's so much power and really just courage in saying that one is not doing well, but also wanting to do something about it.
Mm. And those discussions can really be empowering, can't they? Because what you're not saying is that, if I talk about mental health, it's all about doom and gloom and negativity, and it's all, it can actually be a real healing process. And I think we've got to acknowledge that as well. That's something I think that, again, needs to be understood better and acknowledged better within, different faith communities and different cultures as well. For instance, when there's a death in the family, there's been a loss, and there's grief, and sometimes people don't know how to express their emotions, and it's because that discussion around the grief isn't happening, that the healing isn't happening. And so if we were to be a bit more open about, what, I'm hurting right now because I miss, the person who's passed away, and we're able to kind of really talk through what we're feeling, that there is healing within that. And I think that is also something, I think there's something really powerful within that. That's something that needs to be acknowledged.
Definitely. And I think, especially when you think of the collectivism of it, there's healing in the collectivism, that there is support that's available that we need to kind of start I guess looking into as a community.
I think also there's a misconception that, sometimes talking about these things are, I've certainly come across it. I'm sure you have as well, that, mental health is a very Western concept and it doesn't exist in our culture or in our faith tradition. But actually, how have we come to that conclusion? Why is it that people believe that it's not from within our understanding of life? Because, emotions are from Allah, right? And, Allah gives us emotions for a reason, and all emotions are there because we need to process them and feel them and do something with them. And this sort of this understanding of wanting to be happy all the time or needing to feel happy all the time, it just wouldn't be realistic, would it? Not from a worldly perspective, but also not from a faith perspective. And I think that is, I feel like that's one really powerful way to start the conversation around mental health and faith. So the discussion around, mental health and emotions are not two separate things, that they are interconnected as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I find it really helpful in my sessions sometimes to bring up, really any form of humor, as long as it's appropriate. And I tell my clients, if crying were useless, we'd call it an appendix, right? There's a reason why our body does that. There's a reason why, and it's an emotional release. So I think it's also about, that psychoeducation, right? Telling people that there are kind of reasons why our bodies functions that way. And wherever we're able to, add that Islamic lens, it's just going to make it so much more meaningful.